First of all, good morning to everyone. It is good to be here. As always, we're thankful for an opportunity to gather together to worship our God. And we're thankful for another Lord's Day in which we're able to do that. I think it's understood that for any group to succeed, whether it be a small group or a large group, for any institution to be able to succeed, then it has to have leadership, and it has to have good leadership. Now, the church, as the greatest institution in the world, benefits from the greatest leadership because Jesus Christ is the head of the church. He is the supreme and ultimate leader of the church. And so in that sense, the church benefits from perfect leadership. But Jesus saw fit and sees it necessary to also have the local congregations of His church to be led in some way by local leaders. We may rightly call these men under-shepherds. They are known as shepherds and bishops and elders in the church. But as we call them shepherds, we recognize that they are under-shepherds, serving under the true shepherd, the good shepherd, the great shepherd that is Jesus Christ. But as they fill this role of under-shepherds, they help to guide and protect the flock that belongs to Christ. Now that role is a role of tremendous import. It is a role that we should be seeking to fill. It is a role that men that are godly and faithful should aspire to. But it is also a role that can only be filled by men who are truly qualified to shepherd God's people. And thankfully, God has provided us with a picture of what those qualified under-shepherds look like. And those lists of qualifications and qualities are found in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. In our last study, last Lord's Day, we opened up this study that we plan to continue for the next several weeks on the qualities and qualifications of eldership. We kind of did an overview of these qualities and how we might approach them and view them. And we also considered the foundational quality that is found in both lists of that a man should be above reproach or blameless. I explained last time, and I believe this, that quality of being above reproach is, you might think of it as a foundational quality that the rest are built upon, or you may think of it as an umbrella quality that the rest fall under. Thus, if you were to boil down what an elder is in one word, you may say blameless or above reproach, but there's a lot of other qualities that are given in these lists, and they help us see what a man who is truly above reproach or who a man who is blameless truly looks like. Now, as we continue on past this idea of being above reproach, both lists provide the identical second qualification. And that is that a man who would be an elder, and a man who desires to be an elder, and a man who is appointed to be an elder must be the husband of one wife. Marriage is a sacred and a divine institution. A lot of debate takes place in our country and in societies around the world about marriage and the role that government plays in marriage and who can and can't be married. But we must never be distracted by the conversations of men and forget that marriage is something that has been given and ordained by God. In fact, it dates back to the very beginning of time. It is the first gift that God gave for the well-being of mankind. So it is only reasonable that the men who lead God's church, another institution given to us by the Lord, should be men who honor the sacred institution of marriage in their own lives. Now, be that as it may, while we can all see the wisdom in that, there has, of course, been significant debate through the years about what this quality, a husband of one wife, really means. Now, this lesson is not going to answer every single question that is probably on the minds of various individuals here. Sometimes I think we have to recognize that some of the questions will just have to be dealt with if and when they appear among us. But to the best of our ability, I hope that we can go through this morning and discuss this idea of what it means to be a husband of one wife. We'll also try and consider its purpose, why this is important, and how we might be able to tell if a man meets this standard. Now, before we start this, and this is true of all the qualities that we will discuss, I'm not saying I will repeat this every time that I teach, but I think we need to keep these things in mind as we approach the qualities of an elder. Is first of all, the qualities of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1 are given to us for a reason. We discussed this a bit last time. The reason is not to create some arbitrary list that makes it very hard for a man to become an elder. This is not just a set of challenges for the sake of challenges to kind of play as a gatekeeper so that not too many men become elders. These qualities are meant to help the church. They are meant not to hide men from being elders. They are to help the church recognize who among them is qualified and should be leading the church. Thus the qualities teach us something about the work of an elder. And so as we go through these qualities, including this one this morning, as we try and interpret what it means to be a husband of one wife, and thus apply that interpretation to the men that we may be viewing or evaluating as possible elders, we need to ask ourselves, what does this qualification teach me about a man's ability to lead the Lord's church? And if the way I interpret a qualification really tells me nothing about a man's ability to lead the church, then I should be very wary of that interpretation. Because when we misinterpret the text and these qualifications, we get into dangerous ground. That's another reminder. We must remember and thus take seriously these qualities, because it is a dangerous thing to disregard and misinterpret the qualifications and thus appoint unqualified men. The reason that there are qualifications and qualities given is because the Lord wants certain types of men to be leading His church. And when the church is led by unqualified men, the church is in danger. We know in business and academics and politics that when there is poor leadership, over time there will be problems in that group. And the church is not immune from that. If there is poor leadership in the church, in a congregation, then the congregation will in some way and in some form suffer. At best, it will not reach the potential that it could reach. At worst, it will be led astray. And so we can never knowingly appoint unqualified men, and we certainly should be very careful about understanding the qualifications so that we don't appoint unqualified men. But as we think about being safe and not appointing unqualified men, we don't want to swing that pendulum to the point where basically we never appoint anybody. I think this has been a big fear in the church. We are so afraid of appointing an unqualified man that we make these qualities so restrictive that we end up disqualifying every man possible. And we then get into a different danger zone, and that is we need to remember that it is dangerous to not appoint qualified men. When the Holy Spirit gives us a list of qualities and says this is the type of man that you should be following, if then we don't follow that type of man or recognize that type of man as a leader, because again we have maybe misinterpreted or misapplied the qualifications that are given, then again we are in dangerous ground. When we gave some of the sermons about leadership and eldership in the church, one of the things we saw is eldership is important because elders help protect the church. Elders help guide the church. Elders help the church grow. By definition then, a church that does not have elders is exposed to danger. A church that does not have men that it is following that are godly, faithful men is exposed to false doctrine, is exposed to false practices, is exposed to lethargy and spiritual immaturity. So we should want elders. We should want men to be leading us. And we certainly shouldn't want to try and make it more difficult for a man to become a leader by misinterpreting and misapplying the qualities that we find in these lists. Another thing for us to remember as we approach these qualities is every congregation and every man within a congregation faces unique circumstances. It is impossible to assign blanket answers for every question that might arise, especially with a topic like what we have this morning. When we're talking about the marital situations of a man, every man has a unique marital situation. Every possibility of a man that might be an elder may have a unique situation that the congregation and that man have to consider. It is difficult, if not impossible, to just say, this is the view we take, and that's how we're going to apply it to every single situation in the future. We need to be ready and willing to recognize the nuance of particular individuals and their situations. That does not mean we can play fast and loose with the qualifications. But we need to evaluate the man and his situation, understanding it is unique, understanding the congregational setting is unique. And speaking of congregations, we need to remember that our scope is our congregation. Other congregations may appoint men that we deem unqualified. Other congregations may appoint men that I think he's not qualified to be an elder. But you know what? That really shouldn't concern me that much, because guess what? I'm not a part of that congregation. I'm not under the authority of that man. Likewise, we should not simply mirror our decisions after another congregation. We must study these qualities together as a congregation. We must evaluate men that might lead our congregation. We're not setting up men to lead other congregations. We are setting up and appointing men to lead our congregation. And we must work to make sure that we, as our congregation, are united in a decision of appointing qualified men to shepherd our flock here. And then lastly, perhaps most importantly, we must approach these qualifications humbly. Now, I've studied the qualifications multiple times through my life, and I will say that has been a humbling experience. There may not be anything that I know of in the New Testament that I have changed my mind about in some way or form more so over the years than some of the qualifications of elders. And I don't mean that as in I just flip-flop all over the place. But the more I study and the more I think and the more I listen to others and their studies, the more thoughtful I hope I have become about the qualifications. And there are times that I see some problems in the way I used to apply these or interpret these. And the very fact that that has happened should make me think, not that I have finally arrived, but that I should continue to be humble about this, continue to be ready to listen, continue to be ready to discuss, and continue to be ready to learn about these qualifications. And I hope each and every one of us will do this. Now, we should approach these very seriously. We should approach these soberly. And we should approach these passionately, because I hope that we are all passionate about the church, and thus the leadership of the church, and thus working towards elders. But we should be very careful about dogmatism that divides in some of the questions that may come up. And I do want to say this. If during this sermon or any other study that I give or one of the other teachers give, if we say or present something that maybe you disagree with or have not or agreed with before, I ask that first of all you listen. Not because we are the teachers, but because I and the other men who will be teaching, I feel confident, have put in study and work and effort to coming to these decisions. And there's a reason we've come to the decisions that we come to in studying God's Word. So I ask that you give us a fair hearing. Secondly, if you still disagree, I hope that you will graciously be willing to talk with us, to study, to discuss these things, so that we can grow. We are not going to answer all the questions about what it means to be a husband of one wife, to rule one's household well, or any of the other qualities in one sermon, even as long-winded as I might be about them. We're not going to solve all the possible questions. And so I hope we recognize that this series we're doing from now through sometime in mid-March, Lord willing, is not the end of the matter. I hope this is a foundation to lead everyone to study these. I ask people to study what we teach often. I can't ask it more now. Please, please go home and study these things on your own as families and with others. Please do not leave here and just write off this as another sermon. We are trying to work towards elders in this congregation. To do that, we all need to be working together. So I ask you, please, study these things for yourself as well. Now, with that groundwork laid, let's move on to our qualification. The first question I want to ask, and that is an important question, is does an elder have to be married? With the qualification that he must be the husband of one wife, we might ask, does that mean he has to be married? There are many who interpret this passage to mean that if a man is married, then he must be a husband of one wife, whatever, again, that interpretation might be. But that doesn't exclude men who are unmarried from being elders. That is a common view that you can read about quite broadly in most denominational commentaries and commentators. Now, marriage, we should say, is not required to be a Christian. You do not have to be married to be a Christian. I also believe that unmarried men can be godly leaders in the church. It appears that Paul was unmarried. And yet Paul was obviously qualified to be an incredible leader, maybe one of the greatest leaders the church has ever seen. But be that as it may, I do believe it's safest and best to understand that an elder should be married. 1 Timothy 3 verse 2 says that an elder or an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, etc., etc. Titus 1 verse 6 says, if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, etc. Those are present tense ideas. It does not say if a man has been the husband of one wife. It says he must be the husband of one wife. Now, we may not be able to understand all the reasons that this is the case, but I believe we can see quite a few. I do believe that the role of an elder is one which may often require the support of a godly wife. For the man's own support and strength himself, having a godly spouse will be a tremendous value. Being able to counsel others who are married will certainly require a man who has experience himself. Being able to handle some of the delicate matters that an elder will need to handle, it would certainly be best for him to have a godly wife. When we think about the benefits of a man being married, and when we look especially at the language of the text, while I understand that sometimes it may seem unfair, while I understand that sometimes there may be unique situations that come up that I'm not going to try and answer today. For example, what about an elder who is already an elder and then his wife passes away? I thought about trying to answer that and realized there's just not time to go through all the hypotheticals. Some of these we just may have to come to in the future. But I think the easiest and the safest interpretation is that yes, an elder is a man who must be married. Now, as we look at the qualification itself, let's look at the way this is translated. By and large, almost all of the modern translations, all translations that we look at, translate this the same, the husband of one wife. You can see that long list of translations that translates this verse as the husband of one wife. There are a couple of variations. The NIV and New Living translations translate this as faithful to his wife. I don't think that's a wrong translation. I actually think that gets to the idea, as we'll see in our study. Then the NRSV translate this as married only once. I think that is certainly an interpretive approach to that translation, and we'll discuss that view a little bit later. Now, as to the actual text itself that leads to this translation, I'm not a Greek scholar, so I'm not trying to show off Greek. This is more for visual purposes. This is exactly what the Greek looks like in the text. And if you were to literally translate that, that translates to a one-woman man or a one-wife husband. In the Greek, the word for woman and wife is the same. It's contextual which way it goes, and the same for man and husband. So this literally reads, he must be a one-woman man or a one-wife husband. Now, I think there's some help that we can get, and this is important. I want us to keep this in the back of our mind. We find the same phrase, just the roles reversed, in 1 Timothy 5 verse 9. When Paul's talking about the widows who can be supported by the church, he says that let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband. That's the exact same phrase, simply instead of a one-woman man, it is a one-man woman. Now these are the only places this phrase is found. In 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, and then about widows in 1 Timothy 5. Now I want us to keep that in the back of our mind, because since the phrase is the same, then we should reasonably expect to be able to interpret them the same. And so what will apply to elders for this qualification should apply to widows for this qualification. And I think that will help us in some of the interpretive approaches. And that's important because while the text is simple, in one sense, he's a one-woman man. He's the husband of one wife. That's simple. And yet, for its simplicity, it's also quite generic. And that generic nature has led to several different views and interpretations of this qualification. So let's consider these different views of what it means to be the husband of one wife. One view that has been held by many is that this is saying an elder cannot be involved in, or perhaps some have interpreted as can never have been involved in, polygamy. Now, in ancient cultures, and in some cultures today, polygamy is practiced. Over in Africa, there are times that our preachers and our Christian brethren have had to deal with the situation of polygamy, because there are cultures, there are tribes over there where men still engage in polygamy. So it's not something that is completely outdated and that nobody partakes in anymore. It is even still today a real situation. The way our country is going, morally speaking, it may one day be a situation in this country again, where it's more common. But in ancient times, of course, there were cases of polygamy. In fact, even among the people of God, there were times of polygamy. For example, Jacob had multiple wives. David had multiple wives, and others. But while it was allowed at times, it was never God's design or will. Over in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus teaches on marriage, Jesus clearly teaches that God designed marriage and that from the beginning, God's plan for marriage was one man and one woman for life. And anything outside of that plan, unless specifically granted by Scripture, is a deviation from God's plan and thus sinful. Under this New Testament, there is certainly no allowance or authority for polygamy, either by men or by women. This is true for all church members, and of course, it's true for church leaders. Now, I believe that the qualification, a husband of one wife, absolutely excludes a polygamist from eldership. But I would also argue that a polygamist, if he continues in that state, would be disciplined by the church and would not be a faithful member in good standing anyway. So I highly doubt such an individual would be likely to be considered as an elder of a congregation. And thus, while polygamy is excluded, I don't think that is the focus here. I don't think Paul is just saying an elder cannot be a polygamist. It goes deeper than that. I think, as I said, typically such an individual wouldn't be front and center of our minds for such an office. Secondly, it seems that this was not a problem by and large in the church. While the church wrestled with immorality, such as in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 that we can see, as far as I can tell, polygamy is never directly addressed or rebuked in the New Testament. The early centuries after Christianity, the writings that we can read from some of those so-called church fathers make it clear that polygamy was something that was not tolerated, allowed, or deemed acceptable by Christians. And even in society, it was practiced. But from what I've read, while it was allowed and practiced in Roman society, it was technically illegal. By the first century, polygamy was quite rare in Jewish society. And so it doesn't seem that it would have been a very common practice. And so why would Paul exclude that? But then, more importantly, remember the qualification of widows. In those times in history and places where polygamy has been practiced, it has almost always been allowed for men, but not for women. Women have hardly ever been able to be polygamists. So if this qualification is just saying someone can't be a polygamist, what's the purpose of Paul saying that widows must be the wife of one husband? There's next to zero chance that she would have been a polygamist. But again, we shouldn't say, well, for elders it means he can't be a polygamist, but for widows it means something different. They surely mean the same thing. And so if it makes no sense that Paul's simply excluding polygamists from the widows, then he's probably not just excluding polygamists from the elders either. And so let's consider some others. Some take this idea, and the NRSV kind of seems to indicate this, that it means the man has been married only once. Now, it's not unreasonable to think this. In fact, as we look at the idea, a one-woman man, a husband of one wife, we can understand why a literal rendering and understanding might make us think the man throughout his life can only have one wife, period, no matter the reason. The basic thrust of this is that a man who has ever been married more than once cannot be an elder, even if and including a man whose wife earlier in life has died. The situation, a man's wife dies, maybe younger in life. He sometime after that remarries. Later in life he wants to become an elder, but he has been married twice. Technically speaking, the man is not a one-wife husband. He has had two wives. So is Paul excluding such men from the eldership? Well, first we should note that it's not sinful for a man or a woman to remarry after the death of a spouse. Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians 7 make it clear that a widow or a widower is free to remarry, and such is not sinful. And so then we might ask the important question we talked about: what is the purpose of this qualification? If this qualification excludes a widower who then remarried from becoming an elder, then the qualification essentially becomes a numeric qualification and a fairly arbitrary one that really teaches us nothing about the role of an elder. Now, when we look through the qualifications, I believe they all have to do with attributes that are within the man's control. They teach us something about the man, and thus we learn if he's capable of leading. What does a tragic accident that a man's former spouse had teach us about the man? If a man's wife dies in a car wreck, he has no control over that. If a man's wife dies from cancer early in life, he has no control over that. That's happened to men, to lose spouses early in life, to circumstances completely outside of their control. Does that tell us that he is unfit to be an elder? I certainly wouldn't say so. I certainly don't think we should exclude that man from eldership lightly, especially if there's a better interpretation. And also, let's consider again the qualification of widows. Remember, the same thing is said about widows. Paul says that she is to have been the wife of one husband. But a few verses later, speaking to younger widows, this would be widows who are under the age of 60, Paul says, I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, give the adversary no occasion for slander. Now, if the wife of one husband means that she cannot remarry after her first husband dies, then Paul gives advice to the younger widows that endangers their ability later in life to be cared for by the church. Because if a woman follows Paul's advice, and as a younger widow whose husband dies younger in life and marries, and then later in life he dies also, she wouldn't be able to be supported by the church. Now, do you think Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, would advise a woman to do something that would actually endanger her welfare later in life? That doesn't make any sense. And so if it doesn't make sense that Paul's requirement is that a woman only marry one man at all, period, even if it's just because of death, then that's probably not what it means for elders either. So third, similar to this, but perhaps closer to the point, an elder cannot have been divorced and remarried. This is the idea that if a man has divorced a wife, even if he is the innocent party, and has remarried, that he is no longer valid candidate for the eldership. Now, Jesus certainly teaches on the permanence of marriage when he says in Matthew 19, verse 6, that what therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. This is not a sermon on divorce and remarriage. We can all assume or be on the same page, I think, that the purpose, the goal of marriage is for a man and a woman to be together for life until death breaks the bonds of marriage. But Jesus did provide an exception. A few verses later he says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery. Within that, it seems Jesus provides an exception that if a man or a woman has a spouse who is an adulterer, that adultery, again, I can't get into all the nuances of this, but essentially that breaks the marriage bond if they are unrepentant, and that if that is the case, then the innocent party, that is the party that did not commit adultery, is free to divorce, that marriage is broken, and that innocent party is free to remarry. Now, if Jesus permits the innocent party to remarry, then it is not right for us to prohibit them from remarrying. But can such a man in that situation become an elder? On the one hand, this may be similar to the man who lost his wife in an accident. Perhaps he had no control over the situation. Perhaps he truly is at fault in no way, and he is simply a victim. Perhaps we might see this, and if he divorces his unfaithful wife and then remarries and goes on to lead a godly life as a godly husband and a successful marriage for many years, we may determine he has proven to be a one-woman man. But I will say this word of caution. In cases of divorce, there are always questions. Nobody looks at a man whose wife died from cancer and think, well, I wonder why that happened. I wonder if there's some fault of his. But it's natural in a case of divorce, as sympathetic as we may be to the tragic situation, to wonder what led to the infidelity. Was it truly just one side of the marriage went off the deep end, so to say? Or were there other problems? Obviously, when there's infidelity in the home is not what it should be. Is it true that an individual has no control over his family life? And if that's true, then that actually seems to indicate that the man may not be fit to be an elder if he has a complete lack of control over his family life. That's part of the role of these qualities of his marriage and his children. Is a man that has no control at home probably shouldn't be expected to maintain control and order in the church. Now, it's not that adultery is excusable, but again, in those situations, we may wonder, were there problems that led to this? Now, we don't have to investigate. We don't have to know the answers to those things, and we shouldn't second guess and judge men that to the best of our ability are innocent men. But the point is, it may bring up questions that would make people conclude the man is not completely innocent, or he's not absolutely faultless, or he may not be what we've discussed as blameless. We may trust the man. He may be a wonderful man. He may be able to lead in certain regards, but because of his past, we may honestly wonder if he is truly blameless and above reproach in the sense an elder should be. Now, as I say that, I also want to say we should be very, very careful, because we do not want to disqualify men, and we do not want to wrongly qualify men. This is one of those unique situations. If a man has been divorced and desires to be an elder, and the congregation wants to review him as being an elder, then they should proceed prayerfully and thoughtfully. There is no one-size-fits-all answer that I feel comfortable making. That absolutely no, such a man can never be an elder, or yes, absolutely any man in that condition can be an elder. I believe the congregation would simply have to review that case and come to the best decision possible. Now, another view is that this is not just about the numeric value, but this means he has been faithful to his wife. This means that he has not been unfaithful. He has not had affairs. He has been true to his marital responsibilities. Now this, I believe, is much closer to the mark. But I will say, and I've kind of tweaked this idea to what might be my own interpretation perhaps, I believe it goes a little bit further. But I believe this is on the right track. And I think even the language helps us with this. Remember, the qualification is he is a one-woman man. If I were to say to you, if I was trying to describe James to you, and I said, James, he's a one-woman man, you would not think, oh, well, James has only been married once. James never had another spouse that passed away and then he remarried. When I say James is a one-woman man, or any men in this congregation, what I mean is he's a faithful husband. What I mean, and the way you would take that, is he's a man who honors his marriage vows. He's a man who has proven to love his wife and to not commit infidelity. And I think that this phrase is meaning that. But I will take it just a step further. I believe that this qualification, this quality, is speaking of a man who has faithfully fulfilled his role as a husband. Now that certainly includes sexual fidelity. A man who is the godly husband he ought to be will be faithful to his wife. But I believe this quality shows us the type of man he is in his marriage, not just his sexual life. After all, there have been plenty of men who have only been married to one woman and who have even been faithful. They've never had an affair, but they are not godly husbands. Perhaps they were not providers. Perhaps they were not loving. Perhaps they were not leaders. Yes, they were only married once. Yes, they were even faithful to their wife, but otherwise they did not fulfill their role as a husband, at least as a Christian husband. Should such a man be an elder? No. So let's consider this a bit further and how this perhaps helps us identify a man who is qualified to be an elder. First of all, this is a moral qualification. Now, many have pointed out in writing and speaking about this that the qualification, the husband of one wife, is really the only moral qualification in these lists. Now, while the Bible has a lot to say about morality for Christians throughout the New Testament, there's really not a lot of moral qualifications in this list. But there doesn't need to be. Because we should be able to learn all we need to know all we can know in this qualification. When we look to an elder, we should see a man who lives in purity and morality. And how better can we see that than in the life of a faithful, loving husband? Now, no Christian is allowed to or should partake in sexual immorality. But leaders must have proven, and must, to the best of our ability, we must be able to see and understand that this man is above immorality. If leaders are not moral men, then they may have a negative influence on the congregation, a devastating one. Remember what Paul says about the brother in Corinth who was allowed to continue on in immorality. He says to the Corinthians, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Paul's point is you are tolerating this sexual immorality, and that is going to influence the greater congregation. Now, there's no indication that the man in question in Corinth was a leader. Now, if any member living in unchecked immorality is a danger to the congregation, how much greater is the danger if one of the men who's leading us is involved in immorality? Also, there are few things that damage a person's reputation or the reputation of a congregation as much or as quickly as immorality. We've seen it in denominational realms. Some big, well-known preacher gets caught in an affair, and it ruins him. And it casts a great shadow over whatever group he was a part of. And the world eats it up. They love it when that happens. But it's devastating to the church. If an elder is a man who is not pure, he can very quickly damage and ruin his reputation. And he can even destroy for a great period of time the reputation and effectiveness of the local congregation. Elders must be men that will not bring shame on the church, who will not bring in evil influence, and who can set an example of purity and morality for the rest of the church. And we should expect such men to have proven their purity through faithful and successful marriage. But also, looking to a man as a husband of one wife is a matter of faithfulness and order. If you want to know something about a man, look at his home life. How does he treat his wife? How do they work together? How does he lead in the home? Admittedly, these can be some personal questions. That we don't want others snooping around about us, and we don't feel comfortable snooping around about others. I'm not saying we have to be nosy busybodies. But a man who is to be an elder is a man who must be evaluated. And he must be a man that has been open enough with his fellow Christians that they can see his relationship with his wife. Not all the details, but they can see and understand that he truly has been a godly husband. How does he obey God as a husband and head of the home? Because if a man is a failure in the home, should we expect him to succeed in the church? Probably not. Now, this does not mean that being a godly husband is easy. Being the husband that we are called to be, and the wife that we are called to be, takes a lifetime of work, of commitment, of growth, and of humility. Even when we see a man who's an elder, we don't see a man who has no more work to do as a husband. But if a man has not spent his life working towards being a godly husband, then he should not be entrusted with leading the church. If we know a man has been neglectful of his wife and his role as a husband, we should not put him in the position of leading the church, period. If we question a man's faithfulness to all of his role as a husband, and we should not expect him to treat the church and leading the church better if he devalues his role as a leader in the home. It likely indicates he won't value his position as leader in the church. And that's exactly what he must be, a leader. All Christian husbands are commanded to love your wives as Christ loved the church. If this is true, it is especially true of elders. Elders are men who should be examples to others. How can younger men look to an elder for guidance as an example and follow his example if it's known and obvious that the man has a poor marriage? If the man doesn't love his wife as he ought or treat his wife as he ought, how are any of the other people in the congregation going to look to that as an example? Elders are to be counselors and guides. Would you sit down to be counseled by a man that you knew had a terrible marriage? Would you be counseled by a man that didn't care about his marriage? Would you be counseled by a man that at every corner and turn spoke of the problems and difficulties and pains of marriage? I wouldn't want to be counseled by that type of man. So why would we want that type of man to be an elder? Obviously, we want men that we can trust to counsel us. How do we know what type of men can counsel us in these areas? When we see that they've had experience and success themselves. When we'd be willing to follow them. And that's why we need to look for the husband of one wife in its fullest meaning. Well, drawing closer to a conclusion, I think it's interesting and important to recognize that God does not want leaders to lead the church at the expense of their marriage or their family. There are a lot of men and a lot of women who have had great success, and they've gone very far in their leadership capabilities in leading corporations, academic institutions, and in various political movements, all while failing miserably at their marriage. Often, some of the highest leaders have broken marriages, and those broken marriages are the direct result of their focus on work that actually makes them so successful. That happens in business, it happens in academia, and it happens in politics. It should never happen in the church. And thus, elders must be men who have proven to faithfully love their wives. They are men who have proven that whatever challenges they face in all the other areas of life, that they will do the work at home that they must do. That whatever their responsibilities at work, at school, at even the church, it will not detract from them fulfilling their first role of being a faithful and a loving husband. A man who is willing to neglect his wife for any work, even the work of the church, is not a man who is fit to lead the Lord's people as an elder. On the other hand, a man who has faithfully, loyally, and lovingly discharged his role of a husband through the years is a special man, and we should recognize that. The paramount instruction to husbands is found in Ephesians 5. Verse 25 says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." We can't delve into that. But an elder is a man who has taken this verse and passage to heart and striven to be this man. Verses 28 through 31 say, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." When we see a man who has been committed throughout his marital life to loving his wife as Christ loved the church, then we see a man who knows what real faithfulness is. When we see such a man, we see a man who is one of ethics and one of morality. When we see such a man, we see a man of love. The godly Christian husband is also a man who knows how to lead through serving, because he has done that through his marriage as a man who loves his wife as Christ loves the church. Surely, that is the type of man that we want to lead us and our congregation. That is a man who is truly, biblically, the husband of one wife. We'll draw our study to a close at that point. I know there may be other things that we may have questions about, and if you do, I would happily invite you to ask those questions of me or other teachers, and if I'm not able to answer them, which there's a good chance I won't be able to, we'll study it together. And we'll discuss it. And we'll come to the best determination that we can. But I hope that that study provides us at the very least a foundation to think about this very important quality and to study it further. To think about and start thinking about the type of men that are qualified and are able to lead our congregation as elders. We don't want to close without extending an invitation to any who might need to avail themselves of it. It's possible that there's someone here who's not obeyed the gospel and they're not a part of Christ's family. But one of the things we see in these list of qualifications is that the church is a family, and that's why we look for family men. But it's possible that there's someone here who's not benefiting from the wonderful blessing of being a part of God's family, and we want you to become part of the Lord's family for your own soul salvation, and because we need you, and we'd love to have you as one of our brothers or sisters in Christ. So if there's someone here who's not obeyed the gospel, we invite you to do that. If you believe in Jesus as the Son of God, if you're ready to repent of your life of sin, confess Jesus as the Son of God, then you're ready to be baptized, and we hope that you'll make the choice to do that today. Or if there's a member here who would desire the prayers of the church, either to confess some fault and have us pray with you, or to request prayers for another reason, we would love to assist you as well. So if there be one in need, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.